Okay, how to get Vertex data over to Godot. Let's set up a new scene. I will do a quick run through that uses my node setups, and I will later explain the node setup a little bit more in depth. Okay, so let's add a grid, do some vertex painting on it, just to make sure we have some data on the vertices. Let's call it call 0 or something like this. And I will also go to geometry nodes, add some more data to it. Let's call it some data. At this point, you can go and append the geometry nodes. You only need to add to Godot by value. If you want to store by attribute name, you can also get this one. This one includes this, so yeah, I will just get both. I would recommend to add one more geometry node at the bottom if you are working with more geometry nodes. If you really just want to work with a vertex painting, you can kind of just add it here. You don't need to do this, right? It's just if you are working with attributes in the geometry nodes. So this is the node that I made, which will store your value on your mesh in a way that it will get imported to Godot. Here you see we just put it on geometry. It will add another UV map, which is important for it to work. More on this in the later explanation. And then you have all the custom data that you can add here. It is the data that you have here in Godot on the vertex shader input. And here you can just go on, you get your attribute. This one, we have the color 0. It will spam your attributes a little bit because this is all the attributes that it has to create. This is the attribute we added here in the vertex paint section. To really access all the color, we need to split it to the RGB and store the RGB in X, Y, and Z. We don't need the alpha, I guess. If you need it for whatever reason, you can also plug this in. If you have another geometry node set up that is storing some attributes to your mesh, you can also just get another one of those and go to the sum, like whatever data you have, and plug it in here. If you have some sort of a data type that's not a float, you have to somehow destruct it into a float and then construct it back to whatever you want on your shader in Godot. One important step is still missing. I already did it here. It is important to remove every data that's not written by those nodes, because they can really interrupt the whole flow. Sometimes they don't. Right now I didn't delete this attribute and it was still working, but that was the one big issue that happened in Nasty Games video, where the color attributes would kind of flood over into the other custom values. And to avoid this, you should really delete like all of the values that you put on your mesh. So if we would add some more color data, then it is important to also delete this afterwards. It is called color. I go here and I also delete it here. If you're working with something that's not just colors, but if you also work with named attributes that come from the geometry nodes, I have this to Godot by name node where you can just put in the name of the attribute you want to save. It only saves single values, so if you want to break up a color, you have to do that differently. But this node will automatically also delete the attribute afterwards, so you don't have to do it manually. If you want to access this data in the material, it is helpful to add a material to your mesh, because we have to override the material, and if you don't assign one, then sometimes it works, sometimes not. in my experience, it's always good to have one. Also, if you want to work in Blender and see your changes in another way than just the vertex color, let's say that your color defines a texture, you can do this. Therefore, I added another node, because right now, as you see, we only have those weird 2D vectors that are saved from this node. And to be able to build a material in the same way we would build it in Godot later, I added another node that combines them back into colors that Blender can read internally. So we go and append the store Godot customs to Blender color node. This basically just takes those weird vector 2s and put them back into a color. For whatever reason, you have to invert the R channel. Yeah, but this is doing all of this for you, and then you can go to the shading tab, and here you see obviously the vertex paint is not showing because we are in shaded mode. And now we can get the attribute here. It's called custom 0, and you can just plug it in here, and you have the color in your shader. You could also theoretically use the vector 2, which is this one, but as you see, it only has R and G values, and the B is not there yet, so you would need to kind of construct a color from this. And yeah, you probably know how to do this, but it's easier to do it like this. That's why I built this node. And now you're good to go. You can just save this. I saved it right into my Godot project. Let's make a new scene. And then I will put it in the tutorial object here. We need to create a shader. I will use a visual shader. You can probably also create a written shader, like a code shader, but this is easier for me. We will need to create a material which has this this shader as a surface. Let's set up the shader. First of all, the most important thing is you have to add something that's called varyings, and depending on how deep you are in the shader game, you know what that means. If you don't know it, it's just transferring the data that's stored on your vertex to the fragment shader where you can tell the surface how it looks like. So you add a varying. I call it custom 0. You can call it whatever. It's just important that it is a vector 4. And then you add all of the other ones. Then we go and add a setter, a varying setter, and we want to set one of those varyings that we just created. We get the input node, which gets all of the data that's on a vertex, and here you see there's plenty of data on a vertex. We want to use the custom 0 here, and then I will just copy paste this a couple of times to create the other ones. Custom 1, custom 2, custom 3. This will transfer the data over to our fragment shader, and here in the fragment shader you can now just add a node, and it's a varying getter, and then you get the custom 0, and you can just plug this into the albedo for now. And then obviously this object needs the material, therefore I usually override it in the import settings by double clicking my Blender file, and then I go to the materials, enable the use external, and add this, and there you see the color is already there, but the importer tries to be smart and generate level of detail meshes, and therefore messing up the geometry. So I deactivate this, reimport, and then you see it's the same as we have it here. Okay, so this kind of concludes the quote-unquote quick way of doing it by just using the nodes I prepared. You still have to make sure things are really working out by deleting all the stuff and setting it up right, and also you have to add this node setup to each object that you want to export the attributes of, obviously, because it will not work for the whole scene. I think now some of you might be interested in how to get there. Maybe you don't want to download the files, or you are a bit more interested in the inner workings. The following is all just my personal interpretation. I read some of the source code, but only from the Godot import section, where it kind of calls the GLTF exporter internally in Blender. So I'm pretty sure that all the data interpretation happens in the GLTF exporter of Blender, and I never really checked this code. So I prepared a little visualization. So the way I understand it, our mesh gets exported, obviously, and we have the data on each vertex, and you can see it in Godot itself that this is all the data we have on the vertex. And I don't know which one of those we can actually manipulate directly. Obviously the normal you can play around with and things like this. But what is most important for our case is the UVs and the custom, because we kind of just want to store whatever to our vertex, and this is the place where it's getting stored. And for whatever reason, our UV map setup is important for that. I have no idea why, but we have to accept this. So in my understanding, our vertex, we have the attributes in our mesh, right? We can see them in the property panels under data. Here you can see the attributes tab that there's already something in the mesh from the get-go. We have the position, the sharp face, and the UV map. I recommend not deleting them. I tried, and then things are going south, so we have to accept them and keep them. So we have the position, and we have the sharp face, and then here we have the UV map, and then whatever now we put into our vertex kind of gets added, right? We know I consider those dots like one single element, like this is one single float value. UV maps have two float values, and yeah, I don't know. I don't really care what's happening up here. The thing that's interesting for us is what's happening down here. So we are adding data to the vertex, and one interesting thing that happens already on the Blender side, I'm not completely sure if this actually contributes to the way the data is really read, but you can see here, if I add, for example, just any attribute on the vertex with a data type of float, it gets added on the top of the list, whereas if I add one that's a vector 2 on the face corner, it gets added on the bottom of the list. And same for like the edge, it gets added like in the center of the list. And all I know is that whatever happens underneath the UV map is what gets written into the data. So this attribute 001 now would be considered the UV2. This is also what the Nasty Games video explained already. This is the main information that kind of makes or breaks the whole thing, that you have to add this UV map, which is the first thing, like those two things are considered UV1 and UV2. And then whatever vector 2 you add gets later bundled in the vector 4 and then stored in in the custom 0 to 3. And I don't really know what happens if you put just a regular float in there that's not considered a vector 2 on the face corner. Maybe since it gets added up here, it's ignored. I don't really know that. You can probably find out by messing around a lot, but I was just happy that it worked, so I didn't go there. One thing that seems to be very, very important is just the order in which you add your data to the vertex. And I think the one thing that didn't work out in the Nasty Games video was that they would not delete all the other information on the mesh. So you want to have the right order of data, and you don't want to put in data that you don't need, which is also a good segue over to the node setup, because here you see that I'm doing just that. I am adding my attributes in the right order, and I am deleting attributes that I don't need anymore, just to make sure. I think it also worked without deleting this one here, but in my other scene that I apply this method to, sometimes things get swirled around. To go over the whole setup a little bit, thing. Order and I have up. Those nodes is just a regular store named attribute. The same kind of happens here, where I am just storing a 2D vector. I take the X, Y, Z, and W. I just named them so that they reflect the same kind of naming that Godot is using. Then this is just a combine XYZ with I hit the Z. I save it on the vector 2. I save the other two attributes here. I invert the green. I don't really know why, but the green needs to be inverted. This is just what I found out on my way to victory. Yeah, and I do this 4 times. The naming of the attribute is only important for Blender internal things. Just the fact that you put it in there is enough. You don't have to name it, since the GLTF exporter doesn't care about the names. We just use it later on to compile it back into colors that we can use in the shader. Yeah, so the whole method is kind of working. My buddy Krise and we are working on a game where I'm using this system a bit more in depth, where I'm actually building a landscape mostly in geometry nodes, and where I needed some flexibility to be able to make game design decisions in the Blender editor. In this case, I'm storing single attribute values to the custom values. Since the gravel, this is the gravel road here, is just a value from 0 to 1, or just a float value, I can put it in here without having to deconstruct it. And then in this node, I also, whatever attribute I put in, I automatically delete it at the end also. That makes it a bit easier to work with. Here I'm using lots of attributes to do height maps, and then I use the vector data for the shading. And in my geometry node setup here, you see that I have plenty of different nodes that are adding attributes and doing things. So in my setup here, I'm just deleting some of them afterwards. Yeah, so if you use the whole thing in a bit more complex setup like this one, you should always double check that your attributes are sorted well. I think this is the number one issue, that if it's not really loading in, you probably have some attributes in there that you need to get rid of. And the number 2 thing is the import settings in Godot. I'm pretty sure that there's also some more settings that might mess up the data, like you saw before, where we have the LOD. Yeah, and if you take care of the right order of things, then Godot's really very cooperative, and without even having to export a GLTF file. So I have just my blend file laying in here, and I'm working right in this file, and whatever I update here gets really thrown into Godot right away. Okay, I think that might conclude everything I wanted to say. One last thank you to my buddy Krise that helped me figuring it out together, and the biggest thank you, of course, to Nasty Games, which provided the final steps to really solve this issue. Yeah, I'm never doing tutorials, so I hope I kind of did everything fine. I always dislike it when there's more talking than explaining, so this I hope that I explained better than I just yapped, and it felt like I need to give back to the community a little bit. I also have found a method to import scenes that are completely animated into Godot and using them there. Maybe if anyone is interested, I can show you how it's done. But other than that, thank you for your attention. I hope I could help you a little bit, and if you have any questions or comments, or if I made some mistakes, please let me know. I linked all of the interesting stuff underneath the video, so you can check out the different people I mentioned, and obviously also download the files. And thank you and goodbye.